So if you look at the example SQL data entry.py, that particular module, it's a pretty straightforward module. You can see that we don't actually use even methods. Initially, we just use a try exception clause that's incorporated here. If you look all the way down line 52, you can see the except, which is a light error, an error of basically where the database doesn't work, and then a finally to close the actual database. So let's go back to the top to actually look at what's happening. So we can see that to open SQLite, you can basically just create any database, and you have to just simply type lite.connect. So we've imported Lite as import SQLite 3 as Lite if you look at line 11. Then we create the database through the connect method, and we can give it a name, anything we want. And then you get the cursor, which allows you to access the database you've created, and that allows us to then input information. And to input information to the database is very simple. We just give it a series of SQL commands. And if you look at SQL code, so I do recommend that you perhaps look at some SQL information. So remember last week we talked about polyglot computing, and one way to do it is to send a series of text commands to another language effectively. This is what's basically happening, is that we're sending a series of text commands for the relational database using SQL to function. So in that database, the first line you see is drop table if exists cars, and that's simply a line used to basically drop any database with a previous name. Perhaps we've created a database before. The code that you may download may actually already have test.db, which is the database we just created. So this effectively removes any data, so we're not continuously writing over or writing on that database, and so that would create a very large database. So we do that drop command, and then we create a table. I should say we don't necessarily need that drop command if we plan, of course, to create it only once and once only. But from there, we can then create the tables. So the table is where the information will be held, and that'll refer to the information in what it will be called. So cars is the name of the table, so that's the larger table, and it will have different series of information in the SQL or the relational hierarchy calls for. So once you create a table in the SQL hierarchy, then you can create a series of data inputs within that under different sort of headings. So they can be called, in this case, ID. And you'll see the ID has a second, there's a space between ID, and that space then has an INT, and then comma, name, and then TXT, you should say, text. So basically, what INT stands for is integer, name has text, price has another integer, INT, and image has blob, B-L-O-B. So that's basically a fancy way of saying an image, a figure, a JPEG, or some kind of data that's going to be a picture, effectively. We can call raster data, so that'll also be stored. So what we're basically telling is we're giving names to the columns for this specific table called cars. The names of the columns will be ID, name, price, image, and then we're telling it what kind of variables they will be. So they will be integers, int, then separating all the names of the columns and the types they are is a comma. So each input will have the name and the type, effectively, of information. So and then we go ahead after that and insert specific data. So what you see below the create command is the insert command. And you can see that we add this term values. And then at this point, we don't have to actually reference the names again. We just simply call, or rather put in the order, the values that we enter for the columns defined above in cars here in line 27. So 1 will be the ID 1, integer. The name will be Audi in this line 28. The 52,642 value is the price, so that'll be an integer, and then the 0 is just a reference to image blob. So for now, we're not actually adding any image information. We're just adding 0, keeping it empty. So what you can do, of course, is put information. And then after all the adding additional values, we simply type commit to commit all the data input. And then we can search just to make sure it works under the select command. So select star means select everything from the table cars. And then it fetches all that data. The fetch all command is fetches or gets the data that we've queried. So we can query using the execute select command. select being the text command that the SQL command that you use for querying. And then when we fetch everything going back to Python, we can then simply iterate over all the return values in rows. So for row in rows, we can print the output. So if we run this, we should see basically the information that we've inputted using the insert command that you see from lines 28 through 35. So let's go ahead and execute this and see what happens. As you can see, we got a series of outputs which basically mirror the inputs that we've given it in lines 27 through 35.